Hello everyone, and many thanks for joining me for my talk on reimagining informal food practices. A lot of what I will be talking about is based on work I have done with my colleagues over the years, currently with my collaborators in the Spaces of Quiet Sustainability project, and I wanted to acknowledge this cooperation. The 15-minute format allows me to make 3 points on East European informal food practices, which I will refer to as food self-provisioning, and by which I basically mean food grown in gardens and perhaps on allotment sites and consumed in households, but also often shared with other people. I will start by a string of headline findings on East European food self-provisioning. Second, I will identify what I think are the key factors in marginalization of this knowledge in international sustainability scholarship. And finally, I'll argue for the need to reverse this trend, and I will show that European East should be read as a place producing novel and internationally relevant knowledge useful for reimagining the food system. Indeed, East European food self-provisioning is a widespread set of practices. In Hungary and Czechia, about 40% of the population grow food, and in Croatia and Poland, this percentage is over 50% of the population. It's also socially diverse. People from all educational and occupational backgrounds grow food. The difference between the percentage of people with primary education and with university degrees growing food is negligible. It's also evenly distributed across the class and economic status. And it's a generous activity. Many growers share their produce with other people, with work colleagues, neighbors, friends, and of course with their family. And importantly, nearly 1/2 of Polish and Czech household food growers produce non-certified organic food, that is, without using industrially made fertilizers and pesticides. Food self-provisioning is a form of strong food relocalization with the shortest possible food chain, from the garden to the kitchen and ultimately to the table. And we've also found that food self-provisioning has remained widespread during the period of growing affluence. For example, as Czechs became twice as rich in the course of 8 years, the percentage of people involved in self-provisioning remained the same and perhaps even marginally increased. And now a couple of figures illustrating the significance of household food production. In Czechia, in food-growing households, 40% of vegetables, fruit and eggs come from non-market sources, from people's gardens or received as a gift. And for the general population, the figure stands at 20% of vegetables, fruits, potatoes and eggs. To put these figures in a wider context, in Britain, food self-provisioning accounts for the consumption of 3% of fresh fruit and vegetables and 5% of eggs. What is important for this talk's argument is that Polish and Czech food self-provisioning is not primarily motivated economically, but by the desire for healthy and fresh food and an engagement in gardening as a hobby. Thus, what has emerged from our investigation of East European food self-provisioning was an almost ideal form of socially diverse, embedded, and routinized food-related behaviors that were compatible with activists and scholars' ideas about transformations towards sustainable food systems. And this is a model often promoted in agri-food studies under the Alternative Food Network's label. However, it was not how East European food self-provisioning was represented in international scholarship that had been until very recently written almost exclusively by Western researchers. There were no attempts in these accounts to include insights from this research to inform internationally recognized theorizations on sustainable food alternatives. Instead, Western scholars studying these practices up until the mid-2010s uniformly framed them as stories of survival, coping, hardship, poverty, and underdevelopment. Given that all scholarship is performative, it's difficult to expect knowledge on practices that are associated with these negative connotations to inspire others. And I want to draw your attention to the titles in the green bubble, and I just want to highlight the keywords like back to basics, crisis, poverty, and muddling through. In addition, knowledge on East European food self-provisioning produced by Western scholars circulated within the subfield of East European area studies, with little impact on social scientific knowledge more generally. Jennifer Sutherland described this tendency as a reluctance to incorporate knowledge from European East into global knowledges. This was evident in the citation analysis of 14 frequently cited articles on East European household food production that were written by Western scholars and published between 1993 and 2010. These 14 articles were mostly cited in articles in the subfield of East European area studies. It was so in 72% of cases. Whereas the percentage of these 14 article citations in general disciplines such as economics, geography and anthropology was only 28%. It could be argued, therefore, that knowledge on East European household food production does not travel beyond the region and has only a limited impact on general academic discussions. Without claiming to have produced an exhaustive list, I suggest 4 factors that in my view contribute to this dominant, economically inflected and negatively valorized conceptualizations of East European food self-provisioning in Western academia. These 4 factors hinder the potential of this knowledge to become a source of new reference points on sustainability of the food systems, or its reimagining, if you like. The first factor is othering of Eastern Europe, in which the region is understood as a perennial recipient of knowledge and know-how from the West. One popular strand of research is to study how East European societies receive and learn imported alternative food networks initiatives in their role as passive recipients of Western-generated sustainability agendas. I believe that limiting the research on East European sustainable food systems to imported market-based concepts along the lines of alternative food networks has 2 effects. A, it obscures the diversity of food practices in Eastern Europe, and B, prioritizes a marginal set of practices over the more prevalent ones. In the developmentalist perspective, which is the second factor I want to identify, the post-1989 transformation of Eastern Europe was seen as a unidirectional process of development from a non-market to a market, from informal to a formal economy, in short, from tradition to modernity. There were disappointments among experts and academics that East European household food growers refused to transform into commercial farming, which was a process equated with development. And now I want to draw your attention to the green box. These assumptions confirm Doreen Massey's critique of the tendency in modernization discourses to conceptualize geographical contemporaneous differences as temporal sequence. To cite Doreen Massey directly, the multiplicities of the spatial have been rendered as merely stages in the temporal queue. And as a consequence, there is only one linear story of modernity, and the implication is that the future is foretold, it's not open. The third factor that prevented the reframing of the knowledge on East European food self-provisioning as inspiring, innovative, and transferable to other contexts, and thus as a source of theory, was the focus on poverty, shortage, and scarcity in social scientific analysis of these developments before and after 1989. The point I'm trying to make here is that one reason for framing East European food self-provisioning primarily as an economic rather than cultural practice was the overall tendency to read Eastern Europe as an economically deficient context. This economistic bias, prioritization of the economy in social scientific analysis, applied even to some anthropological studies of East European food self-provisioning, to which this is quite an uncharacteristic approach. This tendency was traced to the Hungarian-American economist János Kornai, whose work was influential beyond the discipline of economy. From the Western perspective, East European informal food networks were seen as an impediment to the development of markets rather than a sign of social resilience, innovation, and creativity, as in Western contexts. And they were not viewed as inspiring examples of creative communality and everyday sustainability as in the Global South. Importantly, as Martin Miller noted, unlike in the South, people have not found in the European East a source of alternatives to neoliberalism and environmental destruction. In other words, in contrast to the South, the East has not become a valued source of knowledge. This puzzle points to the need to consider the position of Eastern Europe in relation to the axis that marks the places where theoretically valid knowledge is created. And that's the fourth factor I want to discuss. From what I have said, it seems that Eastern Europe is located outside the axis that connects the former metropoles with former colonies in the circuits of international accepted universal knowledge. Jennifer Robinson claimed that very few places that have the power to make knowledge originating there to travel most effectively and thus become theory. It seems that this claim should be extended in the sense that these places also get the power to select which contexts outside the Western core will be included in the set of theory-generating contexts. And it's all clear that the European East and its everyday food practices, such as food self-provisioning, have not been included in the range of settings in which theory on food system sustainability is created, despite these practices' strong sustainability credentials. I think it's useful here to remind ourselves of Martin Miller's observation in the green box. In the global circulation of science, the East is not nearly as legible as the global South, where colonialism has created shared languages, institutions, knowledge systems, and social bonds. Uganda is more easily knowable in the global centers of media and scholarship than Ukraine. Chile is more familiar than Czechia, and Laos is closer than Latvia. What does all this matter? Why is it important to understand this missed opportunity or lessons from Eastern Europe that have not been learned? There are two things, I think. First, the gravity of global environmental crisis, to which the mainstream northern food system contributes a great deal, requires searching for responses in all social contexts, not just in the West or the center, where the conventional notion of sustainability was coined and the search for sustainable food system is being conducted. And second, and relatedly, there's a need to find ways of making the flow of scholarly communication multidirectional, as opposed to the unidirectional flow from the West to the rest, that means to the South, to the East, and so on, while keeping in mind the power structure behind theory production. Despite the somewhat bleak picture I've been painting in this presentation, I'd like to end on a positive note and highlight a couple of points for reimagining the food system derived from the research in Eastern Europe and on informal food practices. One thing we have found is that established and socially embedded sustainable practices, such as food self-provisioning, do not necessarily disappear with increased affluence. So perhaps there are some important lessons here on the enmeshing of informal food practices with rapid marketization, and therefore significant findings for societies such as post-Soviet countries or China and Vietnam. Second, scholarship on East European food self-provisioning invites us to reimagine the food system to include informal, everyday, non-market forms of behavior and consider how they fit in and interact with the market-based forms of sustainable consumption. And in our thinking about sustainability, it invites us to go beyond intentionality of sustainable behaviors, to include sustainability by outcome rather than intention, what Joe Smith and I termed quiet sustainability some time ago. It also invites us to extend the notion of sustainability beyond those based on constraints and limitations, and therefore to include sustainable behaviors that are associated with joy, pleasure, and exuberance. And very importantly, I think, we usually think of sustainability as an outcome of developing something new, creative, innovative, and perhaps driven by technology. And I would argue that we should start considering the implications of possible losses of already existing informal food practices for sustainability. For example, what would be the outcome if millions of East Europeans cease to grow and share homegrown food? I think we can guess it would be greater marketization, longer food miles, longer food supply chains, with all attendant environmental impacts. That was the final point I wanted to make. Thank you for your attention.